Ladies and gentlemen, just a few words about cage prisoners before I hand you over to our chair for the evening, Shireen Fernandez behind me. Cage Prisoners was established in 2003, shortly after while after Guantanamo was set up. It was set up originally to look at the various issues of detention in the war and terror, whether at Guantanamo, secret detentions, Bagram, and other places that we don't know about. And you'll recall at the time that the narrative that was accepted was narrative that was given by the policymakers, those who were responsible for the kidnappings and the torture, was that the people they were dealing with were the worst of the worst, and that they were all guilty. And their dirty beards and their dirty clothes was a reflection that they'd been hiding in places, planning the next 9/11s, each and one of them. We, of course, know the truth now, but at the time, that was a very powerful narrative which stopped many people, whether from the press or from politicians, or even from mosque elders, to actually speak up and fight for justice and demand justice. And I think one of the reasons for that was that there was no information whatsoever about the individuals who were caught up in this terrible part of our history. Those individuals subsequently transpired when cage prisoners undertook to document them individually, their families, their homes, their beliefs, their backgrounds. And it transpired, not just to us, to many others, that most of these peoples were totally innocent. That they themselves had homes, they had families, that they also suffered. That dehumanization given by Rumsfeld and others was totally incorrect. And we're proud to say that a few years later, it was the moral argument about Guantanamo and secret detention was won, where even Colin Powell was saying this it's a blot on American conscience. You know, Mr. Obama himself fought his election on the basis that Guantanamo was not what the Americans should stand for. And of course, as we know, the majority of the people at Guantanamo were since released or cleared for release. But that's what cage prisoners will be working on. And one of the things that we haven't had much work done on, and hopefully this evening's work will rectify that, is the other victims of the war and terror. That's the women, the children, and the families. Therefore, without further ado, I'm very proud that as Cage Prisoners, this event on International Women's Day, that we're holding this, and I will pass you on to our chair for this evening, Shireen Fernandez. Thank you very much.
Now, before I started Cage Prisoners, I would always pick up articles or watch documentaries on Guantanamo Bay or the war on terror. And there would always be one view, which was that of the plight of men. However, after starting Cage Prisoners, the first book that I read was Enemy Combatant by Mozambique. And the feeling that I got from the book was that his wife really supported him and was the one motivation which really helped him through his struggles. Whether it was about detainees at Guantanamo or those held under control orders here in the UK, the dominant narrative of the war on terror really has excluded women. This is an extremely important event tonight, and hopefully by the end of the evening, we will all know just how much counterterrorism policies affect not only men, but women as well, and those who are left at home to pick up the pieces. From the wife who is left to raise her children alone, having to tell them that she just doesn't know when their father will be back, or the daughter who lives alongside her father under a control order. These women are not victims. They are heroines who really have led shadow lives. So I now want to welcome to the stage Irene from Bernberg Pierce. She is a solicitor who has knowledge about these cases, and she will be reading an extract, one of the American cases, which is featured in the book.
Mariam Abu Ali went through her college years at Georgetown University with a big, heavy secret. Her adored older brother, Ahmed, was in a US Supermax prison on special administrative measures known as SAMs, sentenced to 30 years imprisonment plus 30 years supervision, then resentenced to life without parole. He was convicted of 9 charges, including conspiracies to murder President George Bush, commit air piracy, provide material support to terrorists, and contributing services to Al-Qaeda. The evidence was a confession taped after his torture in a prison in Saudi Arabia. Mariam was 14 and in high school when her family's tragedy began in 2003 with the arrest of Ahmed, who was then 21, while he was taking final exams in university in Medina, Saudi Arabia. Her parents, highly educated Palestinian Americans, kept her out of the picture through 2 very stressful years of the family putting pressure on the US government to bring him home from the Saudi prison, where they were sure their son was being tortured. Mariam's mother meticulously recorded his occasional phone calls, kept all emails, and prepared a campaign to get him back through a court case. The family relied heavily on Mariam's older sister, then 21, for much of the letter drafting and contacting members of Congress, lawyers, human rights groups, the FBI, and finally bringing a habeas corpus case with other organizations to have him released to the US. Ahmed did come back to the US after 2 years, but to the stupefaction of the family, he was immediately charged with a litany of terrorist offenses, based on what he was alleged to have told an unnamed co-conspirator in Medina about wanting to join Al-Qaeda, and on a confession he had made and videotaped after torture. In court, 2 doctors agreed that he had been tortured, but their testimony was not taken. And when Ahmed offered to lift his shirt to show the judge and the jury the torture marks on his back, he was not allowed to. The prosecution case used Saudi officials who testified via video link that torture was not used in that country. I think we were naive then as we expected his release, Mariam said, looking back nearly a decade. We didn't know then how the post-9/11 pattern of war on terror court cases against Muslims was going to be. Shaky cases, guilt by association, thought crimes, people pleading guilty, though there is no evidence against them, crazy sentences. She was talking partly about landmark cases against other well-known Palestinian Americans, such as Sami al-Arian, the Florida engineering professor. Sami al-Arian's daughter Layla, an established journalist in Washington, D.C., became a practiced and very articulate speaker on her father's case over years, as was her mother from the start. But talking about Mariam brought tears to her eyes and a catch in her voice. I think about Mariam. Having a brother go through all this must be especially painful. In fact, I think of my own brothers, and I just can't begin to imagine how it would be. It is different with your father. All your life you know he can handle anything. But a brother? How could it be bearable?
Well, as you see, we've turned into 4 people now. And the reason that we chose these 3 people to speak on International Women's Day, I'll introduce them when they speak, is because each of them have been extremely involved with war on terror cases, and 2 of them in particular have been involved with families in just the way many of us in CagePrisoners are involved with families. And it's an amazing honor that they agreed to come. And I can tell you I had to use very strong arm tactics on those 2 people to come, because they're so used to doing things entirely behind the scenes that they sort of didn't want to come, but actually they also wanted to come because, like me, and I think like all of us, we really want to honor the women who've been through this terrible, terrible 11 years in different ways. And it's wonderful that you've come, and bless you for that. So our first speaker This is Katiba, who's come kindly all the way from Reading, and she's a long-time Hug supporter and also a supporter individually of women who've been going through very tough times. And if you're ever in a tough position, Katiba is one of the people you want. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Victoria. Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. My name is Kadiba. I am a long-time supporter of CagePrisoners and a key worker for Hugs. I'm a mother of just 6 children. So as you can imagine, my life is pretty hectic on a daily basis, and you can imagine the noise in our house. And thankfully, our neighbour's a little bit old, so they can't always hear it all. But anyway, I feel extremely passionate about this event today. Like Victoria said, there's a little bit of persuading me and another sister on the stage to come. The reason I'm very passionate about this event is because I've been blessed with 5 daughters. One day they will soon grow up to be women, and as a mother, I would never ever want my daughters to be forgotten, no matter what the circumstances. When I asked Victoria what she wanted me to speak about, she said, "Sisters, get with the programme." I had to think long and hard about what did Victoria actually mean. Is Victoria, who is an amazing role model to myself, and I'm sure to many others, reminding us that as women we should be there as sisters for one another, especially at times of sadness and despair? Well, to be honest, I thought that was a no-brainer. When I came into Islam, I really believed that I became part of one big family, a part of an ummah that cares, that we were all brothers and sisters. I have had the honour of being a friend for some years now to some of the women that Victoria has written about in her book. I have met some of the most amazing people who have left an imprint on my heart forever. They have made me appreciate all the blessings that Allah has given me, women that smiled and said Alhamdulillah, which means praise belongs to Allah, at times of such trials, women who are so inspiring and so positive, even when they feel that they were weak, when most of us would have given up hope. There are a few stories that I just wanted to share with you. The scene is set. The husband has been kidnapped. In the middle of the night, he was thrown into the back of a car, blindfolded and handcuffed. So what does his wife do? What was her first reaction? Well, she goes to the freezer, grabs the ice cream tub, and starts eating the ice cream. I asked her, why did you do that? She said, well, I knew that we'll have to leave quickly, and she didn't want the ice cream to go to waste. Being in the presence of a single mother of 6, who also had the responsibility of raising her 3 young grandchildren, she raised them like they're her own, whilst her own children were unable to be in her presence. The reason being they were either behind bars or under some type of control order. Watching her bear the burden of her whole family on her shoulders with so much courage, strength and dignity, while most of us would have crumbled under that type of pressure. Being present when a baby was born, whilst the father was locked up in a cage in Guantanamo, was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. But at the same time, feeling empowered that I was able to be there and be of some support and comfort whilst my hand was being squeezed very tightly. Walking through a mental hospital, not knowing what to expect, looking at the pain in her eyes, she looked dazed, like she wasn't really there, feeding her with my own hands, as she had refused to eat, sitting in the canteen, whilst the sky became red. The man in the grey suit said to me, while smirking, "Red sky at night, devil's delight." You can imagine what goes through my head every time I see a red sky at night. Questioning myself, had I done enough? Did I visit her enough? Did I call her enough? Were we, the Ummah, the reason that she was there? You start to go on a journey with the sisters, and it's a lifelong bond that I can't really explain. They have taught me to listen and not to judge. It's been a humbling experience to have been given the opportunity to be part of their lives. I asked myself, did these women really need me, or did I need them? Thank you.
Now, our next speaker is Aisha. Aisha is a translator and an analyst, and one of the people who has written about all the intricacies of the way the British law has dealt with people around issues of the war on terror. And what she manages to do is to make a really careful analysis and explanation of very arcane and complicated court cases. So nobody is better able to explain to us a bit about how the war on terror is and what it's been like over these 10 years. And again, she's not somebody who likes to speak, and we are very honoured that she agreed to speak to us tonight.
I am an activist, and the main thing that I believe that people should be doing is taking some kind of action. It's fantastic to come to meetings, to sit down and listen, to play a passive role, but the question is, the issues that Victoria deals with in her book, some of them go back to the last millennium. We're not talking about since 2001, we're talking about, in some cases, 1996, 1997, so this isn't a narrative that started on the 11th of September 2001. It goes back even further than that. So if we're talking about problems that go on for 2 years, 3 years, no, we're talking about some people's whole lifetime. Some of the children who are involved in this has been the story of their whole life. We tend to have this idea that charity begins at home, and unfortunately we tend to buy into this idea, we live in a capitalist world, that charity is something that comes out of your pocket and falls into a box. Okay? We also talk about time being money. So what I would actually say to everybody is you have this amazing commodity called time, you have the ability to use your time to do useful things and help people. One of the things that we have in our modern world is most people, I'm sure there's people here who are just checking on their phones, tweeting, WhatsApping, whatever, as I speak, and people use social media, and something could happen right now. For example, I believe it was on the BBC last week about a man who was beaten to death by the police, and all of a sudden we here in the UK can know about that in an instant. You know, maybe people down the road don't know about that. Similarly, there could be somebody just down this road. There are incidents that have happened today in this country that people will not be aware of that have happened. There have been people who will have been arrested, families who will have been threatened or somehow harassed by the police, in some other kind of form or way. And, you know, there's people suffering right now and people don't know about it. And we're not talking about something that's happening, you know, for example, prisoners in Gaza, people know a lot about that. There's a lot of social networking activity that goes on about them. Prisoners in different places. There's a lot of information about Guantanamo Bay as well, which is the main thing I campaign about. But what about people right here, the families in this country who are affected, the individuals? Very often people don't know what's going on. And one of the things I would say is, you know, if you're not able to do anything else, when you hear about these stories, make sure other people find out about them too. I'm not talking about the ones that appear in the Daily Mail. I'm talking about the ones that might come out through more reliable and more unbiased sources than that. So yes, if you have the time, use it wisely. And why is it that it is important that you do take action? One of the reasons why people are forgotten, one of the biggest problems in this whole issue, and one of the words I've heard so many times from men, women, and even young children who are involved in this issue, and I've been dealing with this for the past 8 or 9 years, is the actual isolation that people suffer. It's the feeling of being on their own, of not having anybody care and know about what's happening to them. This happens in lots of different ways. Firstly, no one's going to tell you that the police came and kicked down their door earlier in the week, or earlier in the day, or earlier in the year. If you work with somebody who might be affected by their issue, they're hardly going to tell you that, oh yes, my husband's not around, my father's not around, my brother's not around, but they're not going to tell you where they happen to be, if they happen to be in prison or something like that. So it's not something people are going to share with you. You could go to school with a child whose parent is in Guantanamo Bay, and they're not necessarily going to explain that to the other kids in the class. It's not their problem, but also imagine how those children would then deal with that. Yeah? Imagine how you would deal with it if it was somebody who was living down your street in the first place, and what it would be like if you were then actually affected by it. And the other way that these things tend to get enforced is, for example, in the cases of people with under control orders and people who are under facing the threat of national security deportation, is that we only know of them by the letters of the alphabet. So, oh, today we're going to talk about AA or ABCD. We don't actually have a name. We don't have faces. We don't have real people who we can actually peg these issues onto. So one of the things that you can do is help to combat this isolation. What's already been mentioned is the mental suffering that people actually have to deal with. During the London Guantanamo campaign, we've actually, because we're mostly a North London-based campaign, we've actually met a lot of Irish people, because a lot of Irish people in North London, and a lot of them make the immediate links between what's happening to people in Guantanamo Bay and what happened to the community from Northern Ireland, or is still happening in some cases, over the decades. And one of the things that comes through, particularly from women, is that, oh yes, this happened to my family, this is how my mother dealt with it. And you know what? 35 years up the line, she's still suffering. So, my brother was released in 1972, but this is how my mother still feels about it now, into her 80s, into her 90s. So it's not something that goes away. It's not something that is easy for an individual to have to deal with, especially when there is this kind of suspicion. And the other thing is, if you don't do something, if you're not taking some kind of positive action, in this case, you're actually perpetuating the problem. You're feeding into the narrative that the government wants to give you, that there are people you should be suspicious of, there are people who are bad, the bad men of Guantanamo Bay and the bad people in this country, and you should then stay away from them. So you're actually perpetuating the problem. And the first way of dealing with that is actually finding out what's going on, which is one of the things that CagePrisoners does incredibly well. The other thing about taking action, another misconception people tend to have, is that it's about the size of things. So, if there's only this many people, well, then, that's not a lot of people. So we must have 1 million people or 2 million people. People think if you go to a demonstration, there's only 10 or 15 people. That's not a lot. There should be thousands of people. The whole 10 years of the Iraq War now. So where are the 2 million people protesting on the streets of London again? That's not what it's about. It's about showing solidarity. It's the small acts of solidarity that actually make the biggest difference. That's what people need to see, and that's what people need to know. And there's lots of things you can do. You can work with CagePrisoners. You can work with Hugs, which Khatiba was talking about. I brought along a petition on behalf of an organisation called the Save Shakarama campaign. Shakarama, last British resident, recognised by the British government. Our campaign actually works for another man, but Shakarama is the last one the government has actually asked to come back. He's been in Guantanamo Bay for the last 11 years, and it's kind of like a game of ping pong between the American government and the British government. You ask one, why is he there? They'll say, ask the other. You ask the other, and you get the same answer. And that's what it's been like for the last 11 years. We don't know. Imagine what it's like for his youngest son, who's never actually met his own father. In 2009, we held a meeting about Shakarama, and his son was there. Everybody could have met his son. Shakarama's never done that, and it's his own child.